Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. Today, we are talking about native pollinators in our area, where to see them, and how people can help protect them. Joining us today is Dr. Anahí Espíndola, professor at University of Maryland. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. This is fun.
To our viewers, please feel free to submit any questions or comments you might have in the comments section, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So let's jump right in. So first, Dr. Espíndola, I'd love for you to tell us just a little bit about your work at University of Maryland and your lab.
Yeah, so in my lab, we're interested in pollination interactions. And so we're trying to understand how changes in the environment affect pollination interactions today, but also over time. And so we're trying to use what we call these two sides of biology, using ecology and evolution. So trying to see how, if the local environmental conditions change, how that affects the way that pollinators interact with their plants. But also how this, if this happens over longer periods of time, how this can affect the evolution of main groups of pollinators and their preferred plants. So yeah, we have this kind of like varied types of interests. Right now we have projects working on some endangered habitats here in Maryland, the Serpentine Grasslands. That probably some people are familiar with, and we can talk more about that later. But we also work on, we have some projects working on trying to see how different agricultural practices and practices associated with improving pollination presence in pollinators' presence in the agricultural environment can be applied, and how that affects crops, but also the wild plants that are around those fields. And then we're also working on understanding how specialized pollination interactions work, which is something that I think it's really cool. And so this is trying to see how interactions that involve only very few numbers of partners. So for example, a plant that is only pollinated by one or two specific pollinators, how those interactions evolve over time, but also how they respond to these environmental changes. And so, yeah, there's a number of things that we're doing. We go a lot to the field, but we also do quite some work in the lab, working on like using molecular methods to try to study the history of these species, but then also, and sometimes even using molecular methods to understand what pollinator is interacting with what plant. We can actually extract pollen that is laying on the surfaces of the pollinators, and we can use molecular methods to see what species of pollen, so we can see what plant that pollinator was visiting and try to understand what the floral preferences of pollinators were through their pollen.
So it sounds like in your lab, you're doing a lot of different things. So not only are you studying sort of areas and the ecology of areas, so thinking more like big picture and how everything is connected, you're also looking at some really specific things on who's interacting with who, and then spending time not only outside, but also in the lab looking at things on the molecular level. So it sounds like it's a lot of different kinds of work. That sounds exciting.
Yeah, it's, I think that this can be a problem or it can be a good thing. I have the feeling that I get bored if I do only one thing. But especially I feel that, there's a lot of people that are very specialized in one thing. And I feel that sometimes we need to kind of take a step back and have a little bit of a broader view. And so I'm trying to build that in my lab to be able to move from these different scales, from the local scale and what's happening exactly in this area, to what does this mean to how pollination works, to what does this mean to how pollination evolves, right? Which is kind of different scales, geographic scales, but also like temporal scales, right? Like what happens if I change the temperature today? What happens if the temperature changes over 2 million years? What is the effect of that on how things function? And so Yeah, we have a lot of different things going on. And, in my head, this all comes together in trying to connect these different aspects of biology that I think that we need to start connecting more so that we can actually translate what we see right now to what the trends are, over longer periods of time so that we can also use that to inform decision making
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
conservation or
Right.
protection of certain species. So I feel that it's really necessary to go from the local to the global,
Right.
and one needs to have different methods and
Right.
approaches to do that.
Yeah. And
And
that
I'm
that
really lucky that I have a lot of very exceptional people in my lab that can do all those parts, and they are great, and they kind of work together and they communicate and collaborate. And so I'm really lucky that I have the right people for
Mhm,
the job.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that is so important to think about, research does have a practical application as you were talking about with climate change or policy decisions and things like that. I think that's important to remember. So I'm sure many of the families out there have sort of budding scientists in their families. Um, so thinking about kids who are interested in science, one of the questions they might be wondering is how do you decide what to study? How, as an entomologist, what questions do you decide are worthy of research? How do you pick your topics?
Yeah, I don't know. I function a lot with feelings. you know, there is a lot, of course, of like actual conceptual things that have been done, and one has to follow the how the knowledge and what we understand about the world, what we know, what we don't know, and trying to move
Hmm.
knowledge forwards. But I feel, at least for me, it's really important that I do things that I enjoy.
Mhm.
And so if I'm not enjoying something, to me, it's like a big red flag that comes up and is like, oh, something is wrong. Why are you still doing this if you're hating it? And
Right.
so I have to have that personal motivation. So I really function a lot like this feels like it's really cool.
Mhm.
And it came, I think that this comes maybe with experience a little bit, is that I came to realize that there is a feeling that I get when things are exciting, and that when I get those feelings, it's usually something that is actually exciting in the eyes of other people as well. And so it's like there is this connection, I feel, that of like what I know, the things that you have to learn, I know the background and all that. But then there's this feeling that you're like, oh my gosh, this is really cool.
Mhm.
And it happened to me several times that when I get that feeling, it was actually really cool. It wasn't just me thinking that it was cool. It was really like a really good contribution to
Yeah.
knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And so I got to trust a little bit more and listen to those feelings over time. And so yeah, so that's a general way I used to decide when to stop doing certain things or when to really go for it. Um, for me in particular, my work, I've been working on pollination interactions for quite some time now. And so, but really, I do feel that it was always this feeling of trying to integrate different aspects of biology. And so if I start thinking about my first projects where I was starting to do research, it was always trying to combine these like fields that people weren't necessarily combining at the time. And so trying to do like mapping, like, cartography of interactions and studying the evolution. And it was all these like mixing different methods. And
Mhm.
so for me, that was always really, I feel that it was always very important for me
Mhm.
to be able to do that. And yeah, and I think that pollination interactions are really fun to work on those types of topics from an intellectual perspective, because they
Mhm.
allow you to modulate a little bit the effects of the plants, the abundances of certain plants in certain places, or the establishment of certain interactions or not.
Mhm.
And because we know quite some about pollination interactions, and we have a little bit of an understanding of how the environment affects certain things in pollination interactions.
Mhm.
And so I was always kind of interested in pollination. I initially actually started working on this very specialized pollination interactions that are really fascinating. And so is these interactions where if the plant doesn't have the one pollinator that has to come, it won't get pollinated at all. And this pollinator needs absolutely the plant to survive. And so
Mm-hmm.
these ties that are so strong, I think that those are really fun interactions that are also really interesting conceptually. But yeah, and I've been also working, and this is kind of like the thing that I want to start working again because I miss them. These interactions where it's pollination, but the plants are super sneaky and they will exploit their pollinators. And so the pollinators get tricked into visiting the plants, but they don't get anything from the plant. And the plant is like, ha, I got you. And so they get pollinated by forcing kind of their pollinators to do what they want. And I think that they are super cool because they have all these strategies to, there are all these adaptive traits that have evolved to track these pollinators and trick them and trap them, but not kill them. And it's like all this crazy thing. So yeah, I'm kind of hoping that I'll be able to work again on something like that soon.
Definitely. I read your post about wild ginger. Would that be an example?
Where wild ginger is one. Yes.
Because it sort of is trying to mimic basically dead things, right? Because it's trying to attract beetles who normally would go after
it's
rotting
flies.
things.
It's actually little flies. It's like the tiny, when you go to them sometimes you have this when you have a potted plant and you put too much water, there's this little flies that come around and they're like, that. So those flies. So yeah, it's those types of flies that they try to attract. It's really cool. Yeah, I really like plants like that. There is also, it's maybe less sneaky, but there's also the Jack in the Pulpit.
Oh yeah.
Jack in the Pulpit does kind of a similar thing. So they produce these volatiles that attract these flies as well. And so they try to trick them in and try to like trap them for a little bit so they get pollinated. It's kind of cool. The other one that does something like that, but it's not exactly the same, it's the skunk cabbage.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and you know that it stinks when you walk and if it's flowering. Well, that's why they are stinking, so they can attract. I think that skunk cabbage is also there's also some flies that are attracted. In the case of skunk cabbage, actually they produce heat. So these plants heat up, which is crazy. It's like these plants are actually warm. And so they can attract these flies, and it seems that maybe the flies actually benefit as well because they get warm in a time of the year that it's really cold, and so that can give them some advantages. But yeah, so there's all these cool types of interactions that I think are really fun.
Right. And these are all in our backyard. I mean, they're all in our local woods.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And blooming now, or even maybe starting to end.
Jack in the Pulpit should be blooming now-ish.
Yeah.
Wild ginger is blooming now in most places in the area, I feel.
Yeah, really exciting. So it makes sense that they're attracting maybe not your typical pollinator because it is kind of early still in the spring, so you might not have as many flowers.
There's a lot of bees right now hanging out.
That's true.
Yeah, there is a lot. Here in this area, most bees actually, the bees have this, the wild bees have these waves that are often associated with how many plants are around that are flowering. And so in this area, there's this kind of two waves of bees. So there's a first wave that is mostly in the spring, kind of now, and maybe in like 2 weeks from now, this beginning of the spring. And then there's a dip in the summer. And, if you look around the wild plants in the summer, there aren't that many wild plants that are flowering in the summer. And then you have a little bit of an increase at the end of the summer when you have all these kind of fall flowers that start to bloom again. and then you have more bees as well. So there are quite some bees right now out there. So yeah, that's fun. And there are some, I've seen some butterflies starting to arrive. And the flies and there's a bunch of other pollinators that we don't really talk about when we think about pollinators. But there's beetles, there's flies, and flies will usually be active relatively early in the season. Many are. So yeah, there's a lot of other things. There's gonna be hummingbirds soon, well, I haven't seen any yet, but they will be coming soon. Yeah, so there's a lot of other pollinators that are around. Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about native pollinators. So we've got bees and some flies that are tricked into it. And now we've discussing a little bit about some birds and butterflies. How are our native pollinators doing? And what are some common threats to the pollinators in our area?
So this area, with pollinators is this will maybe contradict what I was saying before, even though it doesn't, but it may sound like it does. But, we talk a lot about pollinators, and this is true for many organisms actually, but it's really hard to know exactly how things are doing without being able to do proper surveys and control exactly what is where. In this area, we're really lucky that we have the USGS Bee Lab that is based in Patuxent. And so that Bee Lab is really one of the national centers where one of the main experts in bee taxonomy is based. We also have the Smithsonian that has a lot of taxonomic resources and knowledge. And so we know a little bit how bees are doing in this area. We know a little bit how butterflies are doing, but most other types of pollinators, we really don't know how exactly they are doing. We do know, for specific species. We do know that pollinators are negatively affected by habitat loss. And so most pollinators are not necessarily adapted to living in cities. And so, and this area, because we are at this edge of two types of climatic zones, so we are kind of not the south, but not the north. It's this transitional zone. In this area, there's a lot of species that are kind of overlapping in here. And also because we have, the plains, but then you can go into the Appalachians. There's all this transition in habitats that are available. There is a lot of potential for species to live here. But most of those areas that can actually carry that diversity are being transformed either into houses or parking lots or roads or whatever. And so there is a lot of those habitats that are being lost. And so there are very strong suspicions in this particular area that the diversities have been going down, in particular for bees, because those are the ones that we know best. And so there is quite some push to try to, revitalize those habitats that can actually carry and maintain these bee populations. Butterflies are also very connected to habitat. Most butterflies are specialists in what they eat. And so if one loses the host plant, so, butterflies are this kind of weird thing. Well, not weird, kind of weird. But yeah, they have this kind of weird interaction and a special interaction with plants because the babies, the caterpillars, eat the plants. So they aren't good for the plants, right?
Right.
Because they eat it. And the adults, the butterflies, actually pollinate the plants. So they have this good interaction.
Right.
So in butterflies, the babies in particular, the caterpillars, are very specialized in what plants they can eat. And so when one starts losing the plants, the special resource for that caterpillar then the populations can start to go down.
Hmm.
And that is a pretty important the limitation for butterflies and moths because they have that type of interaction. So here in Maryland, for example, the Baltimore checker spot, which is actually the state insect, is because it's called the Baltimore. I don't know if you knew this, but it's called the Baltimore checker spot because the wings have this checkered pattern that looks like the flag of Maryland. It's like yellow and orange, and it has these squares. And so, it's called the Baltimore checker spot. And so it's the state insect is actually endangered, is almost extinct in the state.
Wow.
And that species is really very strongly associated with turtle heads. So the larvae feeds on turtle heads. And so because those populations are going down of turtle heads, then they are also suffering because there's no more sufficient resources for them to live. And so in this area, I would say that one of the main problems for pollinators is really the access to proper habitat. And for pollinators, habitat means food, but it also means a place to nest or a place to finish development. And so, often we think about pollinators like, oh, I'm going to help the pollinators. I'm going to plant all these flowers, right?
Right.
That's great. But then, you still need to provide some place where they can actually live and nest and finish the development. And so in this area, because that has to be all managed, there's a lot of people in this region. Most of that is not necessarily, there are many natural habitats that are available openly and well connected with each other for these pollinators to maintain many of their populations. And so a lot of it can be assisted with people trying to plant the right species or doing specific managements of their yards or their lands to try to reduce the impact on taking away the food for the pollinators, but also the places where they can actually nest and maintain themselves and develop. I don't know.
So if people wanted to help and they wanted to make their yards a little bit more pollinator friendly, where would you recommend them beginning? Should they just do some research on what are the best plants for local?
So I think it depends a little bit of what's available to them, in terms of space, right? I think that it depends. Some people that live in the middle of the city, they may not have access to a huge yard or something like that, right? While somebody that lives maybe in a place where you have a larger yard, you have more opportunities. Or if you're living in the middle of the fields, you have plenty of options, right? I think that for me, there's like these two parts. So one thing is, what you can do, like things you can plant and stuff like that, right? But I think that the first part of this is also kind of appreciating things, right? It's like appreciating what these things are doing, these insects are doing, or these birds or these animals are doing in general. And especially because we are in this very populated area, it can be very easy to be disconnected from the natural world. And we tend to think about the natural world as this like exotic thing that you have to go into the jungle and that's the natural world. But actually the natural world can be the little plant that you have on your balcony, right? And you can observe what's happening to this plant, who's coming on this plant. And so that can be a really great place to start, I feel, if you haven't done that already, that is really great. And just like observing what's out there. And if you see an insect or some animal, observe what is it doing? Why is it doing it? And I feel that a lot of what we can do comes also of this appreciation of like how cool it is. If you see something visiting a flower, it's not just visiting, it's like it's doing a bunch of things on this flower. And if you look at it, it's really fun, actually. It's like you look at it and this thing is walking around and like cleaning themselves and eating something and like moving this thing here and putting, and they're doing all these things on the flowers. And so being able to appreciate that, I think it is really cool. But then, of course, there are some other things that you can do than, other than just watching the flower do their thing. I think that, you can start planting native plants, things that, plants that provide resources, probably across the season. Usually we tend to think about flowers in the spring. And we're like, yes, I'm going to plant all these flowers. And then everything flowers for like 2 weeks. And then we're like, okay, I planted flowers. I'm going to go do something else. And so, trying to think about flowers in a way that you're thinking, okay, I need to make food, provide this food for all these pollinators that are going to come throughout the season. And so having flowers that will flower at different times of the day or different times in the season that maybe have different colors, different shapes. We are now, so I'm based in College Park, and we're now developing with the city a list of plants, and this should be coming out soon, I hope. A list of plants that are easy to grow, that can be grown also in pots on a city house.
Yeah, that's great.
That don't necessarily require access to a lot of land, that can be planted, are easy to grow, it's easy to not kill them, and that everybody can grow and that can flower throughout, different species that would flower throughout the season. And so, this is going to be coming out soon, and I can let you all know when that happens, and I can share the links. And so those are really good ways to support pollinators. The other thing that, kind of go into that idea of like, what can we do? It's not just food, it's also giving places to live, making sure if you do have a yard or if you have some plants that would stay, later on your balcony throughout the year, you can also leave some, you don't need to clean up everything every time. Sometimes it's kind of nice to leave, especially if you have a yard, to leave leaves on the ground to cover that ground. There's a lot of insects that actually develop on those leaves. And if you take them away, then they will go away. And actually a lot of butterflies overwinter in those leaves or under the leaves. So if you take it away, they probably die, or they will be taken away. But, kind of, I think that it takes a little bit of like looking at what is pretty in a different way, in a slightly different way. And so thinking about, okay, I have all these flowers and all these stems, instead of cleaning it all up and it has to be shiny and like flat, you can just cut those stems a little, not fully, and leave them, because in those stems probably there's bees that are nesting, there may be other insects that are nesting inside, and if you cut them off, they'll die. And they will actually overwinter in those stems. So if you cut them off, you may kill them, or again, they will be taken away. And so I think that there's those two aspects of like planting things that pollinators like flowers or other host plants for the butterflies, but also kind of toning down a little bit the cleanups at the end of the winter, and realizing that by cleaning it up, we're actually, if we're attracting all these pollinators and then you clean it up, what you're actually doing is that you're attracting everybody, and now you're like, ha, I got you, and then you kill them, right? And so it's like it takes, pollinators have life cycles, and so they need to go through them so that they can maintain their populations. So making sure that we're not killing them after inviting them over.
Right. Absolutely.
Kind of a nice thing.
That's really good to remember. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. So not only thinking about the flowers, but thinking about maybe not cleaning up as well.
And I think that it's not, and it's not bad intentions, it's just that sometimes we, and that comes the observation part, I feel.
Right.
Because if you go out, you put your flowers and you look at them, you observe them, you'll see how much is going on in there. And you'll see the bees that are going in the ground and that are digging holes, and the other ones that are going in the little holes in the stem. So you start realizing all these things. And so I think doing the actions is great. And yes, we need to do the actions, but actually observing, it's really important also to understand why we're doing the actions, right?
Right.
And so it makes sense. It's not just like I'm doing the action because they told me to plant this thing. It's like, no, I understand why they told me to plant this thing, right? And then it's easier to understand why we're doing what we're doing.
So with that, with observing, where are some places that you would recommend going in this area to see some exciting pollinators? So maybe some fun butterflies.
Okay. So I think, and I was saying before that I'm working on these grasslands, on the Serpentine
Yes, and I do really want to hear more about that because Soldier's Delight.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
That place, if people haven't been there, these places are incredible. We do field work there, and sometimes I'm doing field work and I feel that I'm in the middle of the savannah, like the African savannah, and there's a lion that is going to come or something. They are really, they feel really exotic to me, and in a very exciting way. And these habitats are very endangered in Maryland and in the eastern coast. These are grasslands that are on a special type of soil that is called serpentine soils. So these soils are soils that are really rich in certain metals and minerals that make the soils be a little toxic for plants. So they have heavy metals that are enriched in certain compounds, certain elements that make the soils a little hard to live on. And so these places have this huge populations of, these are grasslands. So this is grasses. A lot of native grasses are here. And they are today extremely restricted because the fact that the soils weren't very rich made that people couldn't grow things on them. And so those became kind of the soils where people would go build when the Europeans arrived in this area. And so all that habitat started to disappear. Today, there's really very little remains of that huge grasslands that were present before the Europeans arrived. Actually, this is a crazy thing. So I was reading these historical documents that were describing how much of these grasslands were present. And actually, the natives in this area were managing these lands. And they were doing controlled burns. So they would burn certain parts of this to maintain the grasslands. Through the burns, the grasslands would be maintained. And so deer and other large herbivores like bisons would come and graze. And so they could go and hunt in those great grasslands and so there was this whole interaction with people, native management of these large extents of land that were managed so that wildlife could thrive on the land and they could go and obtain food from that wildlife that was supported. And so that whole interaction of like controlled burns that would promote the grasslands and the wildlife got completely disturbed when the Europeans arrived in this area. And so those lands were taken away from the natives. And so that management was not happening anymore. And what started to happen is that people would put their cows on it because there was grasslands. But the problem is that these grasslands require fire to regenerate. And so over time, the grasslands, they became smaller and smaller. And so there were no more cows, but they weren't really great for growing crops either because the soil is not good for that. And so those were the lands where most of the buildings happened. And so today, there is one of the largest remains of serpentine grasslands that are still existing in this area is close to Baltimore. It's west of Baltimore. The place is called Soldier's Delight. This is managed by, I think, the Department of Natural Resources, the state. This is an open area where one can go and see these remains. There are still controlled fires that are done in that area because it's large enough and far enough from houses that it can be done. There is a ton of really special plants that grow in those areas because it takes quite some abilities to be able to grow on those soils.
Mhm.
And also because there's all these special plants, there's a lot of butterflies that are
Mm.
restricted to those grasslands. And actually, there's a lot of butterflies that are listed in the state that are almost only happening in these grasslands.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's so it's right now it's a really good time to go to those places because first of all, these places right now have a lot of flowering happening. The flowering there happens mostly at the beginning of the season, so in these months now. Um, so it's really pretty. There's all these beautiful flowers of all colors and shapes that are there, but also there's all these special butterflies that are present in those areas. And it's really close, since I started working on those lands, I talked to people that live here for many, many years and they didn't even know that this existed, right? And you're like, you need to go there. It's so cool. And so, yeah, and in the Serpentine Grasslands in Soldier's Delight, there are several trails so you
Mhm.
can walk around. There's some trails that are relatively small. There's even some where one can go see the there were some of the first mines of chrome in
Oh.
the US that were
Uh-huh.
present there because there were so many minerals
Right,
and
right, right.
metals in the soil that those were really good places for mining. So
Huh.
there are some places where you can go see what it looked like, which is really fun. There's another park actually also close to Baltimore that is called Lake Roland.
Mhm.
It's a smaller park, but they also have really nice patches of serpentine grassland that are present there. And also in there, you can have some sections where there are old mines that
Hmm.
are still present. So
Wow.
yeah, those are really fun places to go check. So right now it's good weather. So if people are close to the Baltimore area, that is great. Those are great places to go. And also the soil is really fun. That those areas are wonderful. The soils are kind of green
Huh.
because the
Hence
serpentinite,
serpentine.
the
Mhm.
soil, the rock that gives the toxicity, let's say, to the soil is kind of green. It's called
Huh.
serpentine because it's like this. People thought that it looked like the scales of a snake,
Ah,
and so
uh-huh.
it's like a serpentine, right? And so and so the soils are a little green, and yeah, it's really fun. That place is really fun for many different reasons, and for pollinators it's awesome also as well, also because it has all these plants that are sustaining the pollinators.
Well, thank you so much for giving us all this amazing information about pollinators and Soldier's Delight. There's so much that I didn't know about Soldier's Delight. I had no idea it was such a important ecological area, but then also the history involved as well is just fascinating. So I just want to say a big thank you to Dr. Anahí Espíndola, and thank you also to all of our viewers and listeners. Make sure that you do visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in video and podcast format. I'm Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life. Thanks so much.